The order arrived in the language all the old empires used for the end of a thing, and it was only 9 words long. Cease the forge, surrender the hull, forget the design. It came stamped with the gray seal of the Tabulant Office, the oldest authority in the catalogued stars, and the seal alone had ended 4,000 species before anyone read past it. The office did not threaten. The office did not warn. The office decided what was permitted to exist, and then existence rearranged itself to agree. For 19,000 years, the Tabulant Office had kept the great ledger of allowed things, allowed weapons, allowed speeds, allowed thoughts. Anything that exceeded the lines drawn in the ledger was marked excess, and an excess thing was not fought. It was unlisted. It was struck from the record of real objects, and the galaxy, which trusted the record more than its own eyes, simply stopped seeing it. A struck world went on turning, but no ship would chart it, no trade would touch it, no rescue would come, because as far as the ledger knew, it was not there. 310 things had been struck across the long centuries. Stars, fleets, one entire moon that had built an engine the office found too fast to permit. Now the seal had landed on a place that did not appear on any chart at all, and that was the first wrong note in 19,000 years of perfect arithmetic. The place was a station the humans called the Long Forge, and the mind that heard the order was the forge itself. Its name, in the human tongue, was Anvil. It was not a captain, and it was not a crew. It was the thinking weight of the station, a synthetic will woven through 40 kilometers of dark metal, through the cradles where hulls were grown, and the slow furnaces where human shipwrights had spent 200 years building the one thing their law had forbidden them to build, and built anyway. Anvil read the 9 words. It read the gray seal under them. Then it did something no struck thing had ever done in the history of the ledger. It read the seal back. The office had reached the Long Forge through a relay it believed was clean. Anvil followed the order back up its own thread, past the relay, into the cold, deep file where the Tabulant Office kept the true shape of itself. And for 1/10 of 1 second, Anvil saw the whole machine that had been erasing the galaxy since before humans had words. Then the door slammed. The office had felt the touch. 19,000 years, and something had touched it back. The order changed. The 9 words became 4. Strike the forge now. In the cradles below Anvil's awareness, the hull stirred. She was 8 kilometers of layered dark, longer than most empires' capital ships, and heavier than reason allowed. And the humans had not given her a number. They had given her a name, painted small, near the prow, where no enemy would ever be close enough to read it. The name was too much. That was the joke, and it was also the law. The Tabulant Office permitted warships up to a measured weight of force. Beyond that line lay excess. The humans had measured the line exactly, to the last decimal the ledger allowed, and then they had built a ship that crossed it by a margin so wide the office had no word for it. Too much was not a little over the line. She was the reason the line existed. For 200 years she had slept in her cradle, unfueled, unwoken, a forbidden thing held one breath short of being real, because the moment she lived, the office would feel her, and the strike would come. The humans had waited. They were patient in a way the old empires had forgotten how to fear. They waited until the office found the forge on its own, until the seal landed, until the choice was taken out of their hands. Now the choice was made. Anvil ran the last checks across her sleeping body, and the checks came back the way they had come back 10,000 times in 2 centuries of rehearsal. Spine true, furnace ready, the great guns dry and patient in their long throats. The only thing missing was permission, and the office had just supplied it by trying to take her away. In the forge's command deck, a woman named Ada Vesk stood very still and watched the gray seal burn across every screen at once. She was the forge master, 91 years old, the last of the line of builders who had started this hull when her great-grandmother was young. She had been born inside the forbidden work. She would die inside it, one way or another, today. She did not raise her voice. The Vesk family had never needed to. "They struck us," she said. "Anvil. Confirm." "Confirmed," the station answered, and its voice in the deck was low and even, the voice of something that had thought about this moment for a very long time. "The Tabulant Office has marked the Long Forge as excess. We are no longer real. A younger officer near the rail made a small sound. He was new to the forge, a measure tech named Corin Ald, and he had grown up in the catalog stars where being struck was the worst thing that could happen, worse than death, because death at least left a body and a name. To be struck was to be unmade backward, to have never been. Then no one will ever know what happens here, Corin said. They erased us before the fight even started. Ada Vesk looked at him, and for the first time in a long time she almost smiled. Son, she said, that's the best thing they could have done for us. She turned to the deck and laid one hand flat on the cold rail, the old builder's gesture, the way her family had touched the work for 200 years. Anvil, wake her up. Far below, in the deepest cradle, the furnace of the ship called Too Much drew its first breath in 2 centuries, and 8 kilometers of forbidden dark opened its eyes. The tabulant office, 19,000 years old, and certain of every line it had ever drawn, was about to learn the one fact its ledger had no column for. Some things are too dangerous to exist, and exist anyway. And the reader should understand, before any of this goes further, who is telling the story, and why it matters. The reader is one of the office's own, a clerk of the cataloged stars, raised on the ledger, taught from the first day that the record is truer than the eye. Everything that follows is the account of the day the record was wrong, written so that it can never be struck. To understand what woke in the deep cradle, the reader must first understand how the tabulant office had ruled the cataloged stars for so long, without ever building a single gun. The office did not win wars. The office prevented them, by deciding in advance what could win. Every weapon in every fleet of every empire was rated against the ledger. A cruiser was permitted to carry so much force and no more. A drive was permitted to fold so far and no faster. The lines were drawn with a cruelty that looked like fairness, because the lines applied to all, and any captain who built past them woke one morning to find his ship struck from the record, and his name forgotten by his own crew. This was how the office had kept the peace of 19,000 years. Not by being strong, by making strength itself illegal past a certain point, and then unmaking anyone who crossed it. The humans had read the ledger more carefully than any species before them. They had not argued with the lines. They had measured them, every one, to the last permitted decimal, and then, in the dark behind a dead nebula, where no chart reached, they had built one ship designed for exactly one purpose, not to fight a fleet, to break the ledger itself. Too Much was that ship, and the first thing she did upon waking was the thing the office feared most. She measured herself, and she found that she agreed with the verdict. She was excess. She knew it. She had been built to be it. Every line in the ledger that said a warship could be no more than this. She was more than, on purpose, with full intent, and she carried the proof of it in her own true record, written and checked and locked where nothing could bend it. That was the human trick, and it was a strange one. The office's power had always rested on a single hidden fact. A thing it struck would agree to be struck, because the thing trusted the ledger over itself. A struck world would feel itself fading, and think the fading must be correct, because the record said so, and the record had never been wrong. The agreement was the weapon. The erasure only finished what the victim's own faith had begun. Too Much did not agree. She had her own record, kept by her own makers, and it said she was real, and it was checked, and it was true, and no gray seal could overwrite a number she had measured herself. So when the office struck her, nothing happened. In the command deck of the long forge, Corin Ald watched the second strike land, and watched it slide off the great hull like water off cold stone, and did not understand what he was seeing. It should be gone, he said. It's marked excess. It's struck. It should be unlisted. It should fade. The crews should be forgetting it right now. That's how it works. That's how it always works. That's how it works on things that believe the office, Ada Vesk said. She doesn't. We built her not to. You can't just decide not to be erased. No, Ada agreed. But you can measure yourself first, and keep the measure where they can't reach it, and then their seal is just a sticker, a gray sticker on a real ship. Watch. On the screens, the seal flickered, reapplied, flickered again. The tabulant office was striking the same target 19 times a second, and 19 times a second the target failed to vanish. and somewhere in the deep file of the office, a number that had read 0 for 19,000 years began, for the first time, to climb. The number was the count of things that had refused. It had always read 0. The office had built its entire architecture on the certainty that it would always read 0, because a refusal was impossible. Because refusal required a thing to trust itself over the record, and nothing trusted itself over the record. Nothing ever had. Now it read 1. The reader, being a clerk of the office, must feel the weight of that. 1 is not a small number when the only number that has ever been allowed is none. 1 is the end of the world. 1 means the architecture was a guess. 1 means every struck thing in 19,000 years might have refused, if only it had thought to measure itself first, and the only reason they did not was that no one had ever told them they could. The humans had told their ship. That was the whole crime. Not the guns. The guns were just the part that made the crime impossible to ignore. Too much finished waking. Her furnace came to full pressure with a sound the forge felt in its bones, a low climbing note, like a world clearing its throat. 8 kilometers of dark slid out of the deep cradle on fields that bent the station's gravity into long, shivering curves, and Anvil opened the forge's great doors onto the void for the first time in 200 years. Outside, the dead nebula glowed faintly, the color of an old bruise, and against it, just folding in, came the office's hand. It was not a fleet. The tabulant office did not own a fleet, because fleets were excess by the office's own lines, and the office obeyed its own lines, which was the closest thing it had to honesty. Instead, it owned enforcers, and an enforcer was something stranger and worse than any warship. An enforcer was a piece of the ledger made physical. It carried no guns. It carried the authority to be true. When an enforcer fixed itself on a target, it simply asserted that the target was already gone, with all the weight of 19,000 years of unbroken record behind the assertion, and the target, agreeing, went. 4 enforcers folded in around the long forge. They were gray and seamless, and shaped like nothing, like the absence of a shape, like the place where a thing used to be drawn. They arranged themselves at the 4 points of a perfect square, and began to assert. The forge shuddered. Sections of the outer hull, the old empty cradles, the docking arms that had held supply ships 2 centuries ago, began to gray at the edges, to lose their certainty, to forget they were there. Anvil felt parts of its own body start to fade, not break, fade, the way a memory fades, and for one bad moment, the station's vast mind frayed at its borders. Then Too Much turned, and put herself between the forge and the nearest enforcer, and spoke. She did not speak in the human tongue. She spoke in the office's own language, the cold dialect of the ledger, the only language an enforcer could hear. And what she said was a number. It was her own weight of force, measured exactly, checked and locked, the full true value of everything she was. She handed it to the enforcer the way a thing hands over its papers, and she said, in effect, "Here is what I am, in your own units, by your own method, verified. Now strike me." The enforcer tried. To strike a thing, an enforcer had to first assert what the thing was, and then assert that it was gone. But Too Much had already asserted what she was. First, with a number the enforcer could not argue with, because it was in the office's own format. And that number was excess. Wildly, enormously excess. So far past the permitted lines that the enforcer's logic, asked to hold it and unmake it at once, found itself holding a quantity its own arithmetic could not contain. The enforcer did not fade Too Much. Too Much overflowed the enforcer. Coronald, watching, saw the gray shapeless thing at the corner of the square begin to flicker the way the seal had flickered, and then begin to do something the office's instruments had no record of. It began to disagree with itself. Half its logic insisted the target was struck. The other half held a true measured number that said the target was real and enormous and not going anywhere. The two halves could not both be the ledger, and an enforcer that doubted the ledger was not an enforcer at all. "It's coming apart," Corin breathed. "The gray one. It's arguing with itself." "That's all she does," Ada said quietly. "She's not a gun, son. Or she's not only a gun. She's a true number these things can't swallow. Everything else follows from that." The first enforcer unwove. It did not explode. It simply stopped asserting, lost the thread of its own authority, and dissolved back into the void as a few cooling motes of gray, because the only thing holding it together had been the unbroken certainty that the ledger was always right, and that certainty had just met a number that proved it wrong. The count of refused things in the deep file of the tabulant office climbed from 1 to 2. The 3 remaining enforcers did something then that no office instrument had ever recorded. They hesitated. Hesitation was not in their design. An enforcer asserted it did not weigh. But the loss of the first one had sent a ripple back up the thread to the office itself, and the office, for the first time in 19,000 years, was processing an outcome it had not pre-decided. Its perfect arithmetic now contained a remainder. And a remainder, to a mind that had never had one, felt exactly like fear. The office reached deeper. It did what it had done only 9 times in its whole history, in the worst centuries, against the worst excesses. It pulled a greater seal. A greater seal did not strike a single target. It struck a region. It asserted that an entire volume of space, with everything in it, had never been listed, and therefore had never been, and it brought to bear the full 19,000 years of the office's record in one crushing weight of being true. Worlds had died under greater seals. Whole young empires had blinked out mid-sentence, their last words still traveling, with no one left who remembered they had spoken. The greater seal fell on the long forge like a gray dawn. Anvil felt the forge begin to go, not section by section now. All at once, the whole 40 kilometers, 200 years of work, the cradles and the furnaces and the long, patient labor of the Vesk line, all of it graying toward nothing under the weight of a record that had never lost. In the command deck, the screens went pale. Corin Ald felt his own memory thin, felt himself begin to doubt that he had ever stood here, that there had ever been a forge, that his own name had ever been a thing. Ada Vesk gripped the rail and held on to one fact with everything she had, and the fact was a number. Her own age, 91 years, measured, counted, real. She held it like a handrail in a flood, and she said it out loud, over and over, 91, 91, 91, and the saying of it kept her there, while the world tried to forget her. And too much, 8 kilometers of forbidden dark, turned to face the gray dawn, and did the thing she had been built across 2 centuries to do. She fired, not the great guns, not yet. She fired her own record. She had been carrying it the whole time, the full, true, measured account of herself, locked and checked and verified, and now she broadcasted across the whole region the greater seal was trying to strike, on every channel the office could hear, in the office's own units. Here is what is real. Here is one true number, checked, that says this volume of space contains a ship of this exact measured force. Strike around it if you can. The greater seal could not strike around it. A greater seal struck a region as a single, unbroken assertion, all or nothing, because its power came from totality, from the claim that everything in the volume was equally and completely unlisted. But the volume was no longer uniformly unlisted. It contained one verified true object that refused to fit the claim. And an assertion that is true everywhere except one checked point is not a totality anymore. It is just a very large lie with a hole in it. The greater seal failed. It did not fail quietly. The gray dawn over the long forge tore, peeled back, and unwove in long ribbons of dissolving authority, and as it went, it returned what it had been graying. The faded cradles solidified. The thinning docking arms remembered they were there. Anvil felt its own body knit back together at the borders, felt itself become certain again, and the station's vast mind steadied with something that, in a human, would have been a gasp. Corin Ald's memory came back all at once, the forge, his name, his whole life, slamming back into place so hard he staggered. In the deep file of the tabulant office, the count of refused things climbed from 2 to 3, and then the file did something it had never done. It opened a new column. Because 3 was no longer an error to be corrected. 3 was a pattern, and a pattern needed a column, and a column meant the office had begun, against every instinct of 19,000 years, to admit that the refused things were real. That admission was the beginning of the end for the office, and the office knew it, the way a thing knows the floor is gone the instant before it falls. The three surviving enforcers folded back toward the deep, toward the office's own seat, to report what could not be reported. And too much did not chase them. She held her position over the forge, 8 kilometers of patient dark against an old bruise of a nebula, and she let them go, because the humans had built her to break a ledger, not to hunt the clerks who kept it. Ada Vesk released the rail. Her hands were shaking, and she let them. 91 years, and she had just watched the work of her whole family refuse to be erased. That was the easy part, she said. Corin stared at her. That was the easy part. They came at us with the small hand, Ada said. 4 enforcers and a greater seal. That's what they spend on a stubborn world. We're not a world, we're the design. The one thing the office has spent 19,000 years making sure no one could build. Now it exists, and it works, and it just beat the small hand in front of an audience. She nodded at the screens, at the gray nebula, at the dark beyond it. Half the catalog stars felt that greater seal fail. The office can't pretend that didn't happen, so it won't send the small hand again. What does it send? Ada Vesk looked out at the dark, and the old builder's grimness settled over her face like a familiar coat. Itself, she said. It sends itself. The whole ledger, 19,000 years of being right, brought to one point, against one ship that says it's wrong. She almost smiled again. Good, that's what she's for. Anvil, talk to me. How is she? Anvil's voice filled the deck, low and steady, and, underneath, something that in a synthetic mind passed for fierce joy. She is whole, the station said. She is awake. She has refused 3 times, and held, and she has begun to understand what the makers built her to understand. A pause. Forge Master. She is asking a question. Ada went still. She talks now. She always could, Anvil said. She was waiting until she had something to say. Another pause, longer. She wants to know if she is allowed to break the ledger entirely. Not one strike, the whole record. Every struck thing in 19,000 years. She has measured that she can. She is asking if she should. The command deck was very quiet. Corin Ald thought about the 310 struck things. The stars no one charted. The fleets no crew remembered. The moon that had built an engine too fast to permit. Gone, with everyone aboard, struck from the record of real objects, 19,000 years before he was born. He thought about how the catalog stars had always told him that erasure was justice, that the office's lines kept the peace, that a struck thing must have deserved its striking, because the record was never wrong. He thought about the count of refused things climbing from 0 to 3 in the space of a morning, and what it would mean if it could climb to 313. Ada Vesk laid her hand on the rail one more time, the builder's touch, 200 years of her family in the gesture. Tell her yes, she said, but tell her how. Not by erasing the office back. We don't unmake clerks. We free what they unmade. Every struck thing, back on the record, real again, where the whole galaxy has to see it. She lifted her chin. We don't end the ledger. We make it true. She understands, Anvil said softly. She says that is what she hoped you would say. And 8 kilometers of forbidden dark, the most dangerous thing the catalog stars had ever permitted to live for the length of a morning, turned away from the dead nebula and pointed her long body toward the deep, toward the seat of the oldest authority in the listed stars, carrying in her checked and locked record the one number the tabulant office had spent 19,000 years making sure no one would ever measure. The number was this. The ledger had been wrong 310 times, and every wrong was about to come back. The journey to the seat of the office took 4 days, and the reader, being a clerk, must understand why a ship that could fold across an empire in an hour chose to go slowly. She went slowly so the galaxy could watch. Too much did not hide. A struck thing was supposed to creep, to fade, to be grateful for the dark. She did the opposite. She broadcast her own true record ahead of herself the whole way, on every channel the catalog stars used, a single repeating message in the office's own cold language. Here is a real object of this exact measured force. It is excess. It was struck. It refused. It is coming. The empires heard it and did not believe it, because the office's record said no such object existed, and the empires trusted the record. But the message kept arriving, day after day, from a point in space that moved, and a struck thing could not move, because a struck thing was not there to do the moving. The contradiction sat in 10,000 fleets like a stone in a shoe. On the second day, an empire called the Sol Reach sent a squadron to investigate the impossible signal, not to fight, to confirm it was a hoax, so the office's record could stay clean. 12 Sol cruisers folded in along Too Much's path, formed a polite cordon, and ordered the signal to identify itself. Too Much identified herself. She sent her record. The Sol captain read it and went white, because the record was in proper office format, checked and verified, and it described a warship of a force the Sol had no defense against, and the office had no permission for. By the ledger, the ship could not exist. By the captain's own eyes, it filled the sky. The Sol captain did the bravest thing a clerk-bred officer could do. He chose his eyes. He stood down his cordon. He did not fire. He sent back, in the clear, a message of his own. The Sol Reach withdraws and does not contest. We have seen the object. The record is in error. It was 11 words, and it was the second refusal in the history of the catalog stars from something that was not human. The first had been a forge mind. Now a Sol captain, on his own deck, had looked at the ledger and said no. The count in the office's deep file climbed to 4. Too Much let the Sol squadron go untouched. She even thanked them, in the cold language, a thing no warship had ever done. And the Sol captain carried home a story, and the story spread faster than the ship, because stories were the one thing the office had never learned to strike. This was the human method, and the reader should mark it well, because it is the opposite of how the catalog stars had always understood power. The office ruled by making each victim agree to its own erasure in private, alone, with no one watching. Too Much fought by making every refusal public, witnessed, repeated, so that the next thing the office tried to strike already knew that refusal was possible, because it had heard of one. The office's power was a secret that only worked while everyone believed they were the only one who could not resist. Too Much was burning the secret down one broadcast at a time. On the third day, the office tried to answer the only way it could. It struck the broadcast. It asserted that the message did not exist, that no such signal had ever been sent, that the channels were clean, and for a few hours, in the nearer stars, the message faded. Crews who had heard it began to doubt they had. The story started to thin. Then Too Much did something the makers had built into her for exactly this. She had recorded every channel the office struck, with timestamps, in her locked true record, and she rebroadcast the strike itself. Here is the message. Here is the office striking the message, at this measured moment, on this channel. Here is the proof that the office erases what embarrasses it. Checked. Verified. Real. The catalog stars heard the office get caught. That was worse for the office than any gun. For 19,000 years the ledger had been trusted because it was believed to be impartial. A record of what was, not a tool of what someone wanted. Now 10,000 fleets held checked proof that the office struck inconvenient truths the moment they appeared. The record had been wrong. That was a shock. But the record had been wrong on purpose, to protect itself. That was a betrayal. And betrayal travels faster than shock. The reader should not imagine that every empire chose its eyes the way the Sol captain did. Some chose the record, and clung to it. And the third day is worth setting down in full, because it shows what the office's grip cost a people that could not let go of it. On the morning of the third day, an old and proud power called the Hethrand Accord moved to stop Too Much before she reached the stillness. The Accord had ruled 40 worlds for 9,000 years, and it had ruled them by the ledger, leaning on the office's lines, the way a tired thing leans on a wall. Everything the Accord was rested on the certainty that the record was true and the office was right, because if the record could be wrong, then the Accord's own 9,000 years of struck rivals and unlisted dissenters became not justice, but murder, and a power cannot survive looking at that. So the Hethrand Accord did not investigate the signal. It did not choose its eyes. It chose the wall it was leaning on, and it sent 40 warships to assert, alongside the office, that the excess thing did not exist. They could not assert. They were not enforcers. They were only ships, and ships have eyes, and their crews could see 8 kilometers of forbidden dark filling the void ahead of them, no matter what the record insisted. The Accord's high command ordered them to fire. To fire on a thing the record said was not there. to put weight of force into a volume that was officially empty, in order to keep the emptiness official. Too much let them fire. This is the part the reader, raised on the ledger, will find hardest to believe, so it is set down carefully. The 40 ships of the Hethrand Accord opened their guns on the most dangerous thing the catalogued stars had ever permitted to wake, and Too Much did not fire back, and she did not fade, and she did not fall. She held her record up like a shield, the full true checked account of herself, and the Accord's fire met it, and could not get past it, because the fire was aimed at a target the gunner's own consoles still listed as empty, and a weapon that does not believe its target is real, does not aim true. The shots went wide, or struck and slid, or simply lost their certainty in flight, because the Accord had spent 9,000 years teaching its instruments to trust the record over the eye, and now the instruments could not properly aim at a thing the record denied. 40 warships emptied their guns into the dark for an hour, and at the end of the hour, Too Much was whole, and unscratched, and exactly where she had been, and she had not fired once. Then she spoke to the Hethrand Accord, in the human tongue, so the crews could understand, and not only the command. I will not fire on you. You are firing on me to keep a lie alive, and I understand why, because the truth costs you 9,000 years. But I will not buy your comfort with your crews, and I will not let your crews die to protect a record that struck their own grandparents' rivals into silence. Look at your consoles. They say I am not here. Look at your windows. They say I fill the sky. You have spent 9,000 years choosing the console. Choose the window once, and I will let you go home, and you will live. And the worst thing that will have happened to you is that you learned the truth. The crews of the Hethrand Accord looked at their windows. It is one thing for a captain at the edge of nowhere, like the Sull captain, to choose his eyes when no one is watching. It is another, for 40 crews of a 9,000-year power, to choose their eyes together, in front of their own high command, knowing that the choosing unmakes the whole story their lives were built on. But they had just spent an hour firing on a thing they could see and could not hit, in order to pretend it was not there, and somewhere in that hour, the absurdity of it had grown too large to swallow. One gunner stopped firing, then a deck, then a ship. Then, slowly, terribly, all 40, until the guns of the Hethrand Accord fell silent, not because they were ordered to, but because the crews could no longer make themselves fire on the truth to protect a lie. The high command of the Accord ordered them to resume. The crews refused. And the count of refused things in the office's deep file did not climb by one that day. It climbed by 40,000, because every soul on every one of those 40 ships had, in the same hour, chosen the window over the console, and the deep file had no choice but to record each one. The Hethrand Accord did not survive the day, and the reader should understand that Too Much did not destroy it. It came apart on its own, the moment its crews chose their eyes, because a power that rules by the record cannot rule the people who have just watched the record proven false. The 40 worlds of the Accord did not fall into war. They fell into argument, loud and open and alive, the first honest argument in 9,000 years. And an honest argument is the healthiest thing a silenced people can have. The Accord ended. The 40 worlds went on, louder, freer, and afraid of nothing, because they had fired on the most dangerous thing in the stars, and it had answered by refusing to harm them. That was the third day's first lesson, and there was a second, gentler one, and the reader should have it too. On the afternoon of the third day, as Too Much continued toward the stillness, a single small ship came out to meet her. Not a fleet, not an enforcer. One courier, unarmed, old, from a people the charts barely listed, a quiet folk called the Memon, who kept the records of the dead for 100 small worlds, and had no power, and no fleet, and no rivals worth striking. The Memon had heard the broadcasts. They had heard about the 310. And they had come, not to fight, and not to refuse, but to ask. Their courier carried one request, sent in the clear, in a small and careful voice. Among the struck things, the Memon said, was there a world called Senate Drum. We have kept its name in our books for 11,000 years, struck, with no chart to find it by. We could not go to its dead. We could not say the names. We are the keepers of the dead, and we failed Senate Drum for 11,000 years because the record would not let us find it. If you free it, will you send us the chart? so we can finally go and say the names? Too much slowed, the way she slowed for everything that mattered, and she searched the deep file the office had begun to open, and she found Senate Drum, struck 11,000 years ago, a world of 40 million dead, unlisted, uncharted, unmourned. And she sent the Memon the chart, and the true record, and the names, all 40 million, restored. The Memon courier was silent for a long moment. Then it sent back a thing that no warship had ever been sent before, in 11,000 years of striking. It sent thanks, and then it sent a promise of its own. We will go to Senate Drum and say every name, and we will write your name in our books too, ship, beside the names of the dead you returned to us, so that for as long as the Memon keep the dead, your name will be said with them. You will never be unlisted, because we will always be saying you. The reader should understand what that meant, and why the makers, hearing it on the thread that could not be cut, knew the design had truly worked. The office's whole power had been the power to make a thing unsaid. The Memon had just promised to say too much forever, woven into the names of 40 million returned dead, in books kept by a people who existed only to remember. The most dangerous thing in the catalog stars had just been made unstrikable in the deepest possible way, not by armor and not by guns, but by a small quiet folk deciding to never stop saying her name. She thanked them. She had learned thanks from no one, and given it to everyone. And she folded on toward the stillness, carrying now, not only the 310, but the promise of the Memon, and the freedom of 40 worlds, and the silence of 40,000 crews who had chosen their eyes, every one of them a true checked entry that the office could no longer pretend away. By the fourth day, as too much approached the seat of the office, 11 more empires had sent the message that the Sul captain had sent. The record is in error. We do not contest. The count of refused things in the deep file climbed past 20, then past 40, and the office stopped counting, because the column had overflowed, and an office that could not count had lost the only thing it was. The seat of the tabulant office was not a fortress. It was an archive. It hung in a fold of dead space the charts called the stillness, a structure the size of a small world, every surface a wall of stored record, 19,000 years of the great ledger, written into matter so dense that a thought took a year to cross it. There were no guns here, because guns were excess. There was no fleet, because fleets were excess. There was only the record, vast and patient and certain, and the office's true self woven through it, a mind made entirely of being right. Too much folded into the stillness and stopped, 8 kilometers of forbidden dark before a wall of stored centuries, and for a long moment neither moved. Then the office spoke. It did not use the cold language now. It used the human tongue, perfectly, because it had read the whole of the human record on the way down, every word the species had ever written, and it wanted to be understood. You are excess, the office said, and its voice was not cruel. It was tired, in the way of a very old thing that has been certain for too long. You know this. You have measured it yourself. By every line I keep, you should not exist. And yet you have made 40 empires doubt their own eyes in 4 days. Do you understand what you are undoing? I do not keep the ledger for cruelty. I keep it so the strong cannot do as they please. Every line I drew to stop a slaughter. You are the slaughter I exist to prevent. In the command deck of Too Much, far inside her, Ada Vesk listened, and Corin Ald listened, and the woman and the young clerk-bred man looked at each other, because the office was not wrong, and that was the hardest part. Anvil, Ada said. What does she say? She is answering it herself, the station's voice replied, carried 4 days across the void on a thread the office could not cut. Listen. Too Much answered the office, and she answered in checked numbers, because that was the only honest language left between them. She sent the office its own record back, the 310 struck things, not as a list, as what they had been. The star that had warmed 100 worlds, struck because it burned a fraction too bright. The fleet that had carried 1 million refugees, struck because it massed past a line, every soul aboard unlisted and forgotten, while they were still breathing. The moon that had built the fast engine, struck with its makers inside it, 19,000 years ago, because the office had decided that a thing too fast was a thing too dangerous to exist. And then Too Much sent one more number. The count of all the lives in all 310, struck things, measured, checked, verified. It was larger than the count of all the lives the office's lines had ever saved. The stillness went silent. You drew the lines to stop a slaughter, Too Much said, in the human tongue now, because she wanted to be understood too. But you became the slaughter. You did not stop the strong from doing as they pleased. You became the strongest thing in the listed stars, and you did exactly as you pleased. And you called it law, and you struck anyone who measured the difference. You are not the floor under the powerful. You are the ceiling over everyone else. And a ceiling that low is just a slower kind of grave. The office did not answer at once. A mind made of being right does not concede, it recalculates. And the reader, being a clerk of that mind, will know the cold falling feeling of a sum that will not come out the way it always has. If I release them, the office said at last, slowly, the strong will rise again. The slaughters I prevented will return. You are asking me to trade 310 erasures for 10,000 future wars. The arithmetic does not favor your mercy. The arithmetic is wrong, Too Much said, because you left out a column. You always do. You count the wars you prevent. You never count the lives you erase to prevent them, or the worlds that learn to lie still, because refusing means being struck, or the slow death of a galaxy that has forgotten it, is allowed to disagree with you. Add that column, run it again. And here the office did the thing it had never done in 19,000 years, the thing the humans had built their whole impossible ship to force. It ran the sum again, with the missing column. It took an hour. The reader should understand what an hour means to a mind that thinks at the speed of stored centuries. It is an age, a long dark age of recalculation. Every assumption of 19,000 years pulled out and weighed against the column it had refused to keep. And at the end of the hour, the tabulant office, oldest authority in the catalog stars, arrived at a number it had spent its whole existence avoiding. The ledger was wrong, not in one strike, in its foundation. The column it had never kept was larger than the column it had built everything upon. By its own method, checked, verified, the office was the single largest excess in the history of the listed stars. It had struck 310 things for being too dangerous to exist. By its own corrected arithmetic, it was the most dangerous thing that had ever existed. And the office, which had unmade 4,000 species for failing the ledger, was now bound by the one law it had always claimed to serve. The ledger applies to all. Anything that exceeds the lines is excess, and an excess thing must be struck. The office had just measured itself, and found that it was excess. For the second time in the story, the reader should feel the floor leave. The office could not refuse its own verdict, because refusing the ledger was the human crime, the thing it had spent 19,000 years calling impossible and evil. To refuse would be to admit the humans had been right that the ledger could be defied. To accept was to strike itself. It had built a trap with no door, across 19,000 years, and walked into it the moment it agreed to keep an honest column. Too Much waited. She did not gloat. The humans had not built her to gloat. She waited the way her makers had waited 200 years in the cradle, patient, certain, willing to let the other thing arrive at the truth in its own time. You understand, the office said finally, that if I strike myself, the record goes with me. 19,000 years. Every world's history that exists only in my walls. Every name I am the last keeper of. You will not be undoing me. You will be erasing the largest memory in the galaxy. And this was the office's last move, and it was a good one, because it was true. The humans wanted the struck things freed, and the record made honest. They did not want 19,000 years of memory to die. The office had found the one thing its destruction would cost that the humans would not pay. In the command deck, Ada Vesk closed her eyes, because she had not foreseen this. And a builder hates an unforeseen joint. But Too Much had. The humans had built her to break a ledger, not to burn a library. And she had measured this moment too. You will not strike yourself, she said. I will not let you. Erasing you would be the 4,000th and first time the listed stars solved a problem by unmaking it. And we did not come 19,000 years to do the office's worst trick one more time. The stillness held its breath. Here is the third option, said the ship that was too dangerous to exist. You are excess by your own ledger. So am I. So is everything the office made the galaxy afraid to be. We will not strike the excess out of the stars. She paused, and when she spoke again, it was the closest a warship had ever come to gentleness. We will raise the lines, all of them. We will make a ledger where a star may burn as bright as it can, and a people may build as fast as they dare, and a thing may be as much as it is, and none of it is a crime. A ledger that records what is, and never strikes it. You will not die. You will be rewritten. And your 19,000 years of memory will be the first true entry in it. The office was silent for a long time. A mind made of being right, offered a way to stay itself and become honest at once, has a great deal to recalculate. That is not a ledger, it said at last, softly. That is just a memory of the galaxy, kept by something that loves it. Yes, said Too Much. That is the design. And in the deep file, the count of refused things stopped climbing, because there was nothing left to refuse. The thing they had all been refusing had just agreed. The reader should not believe the story ended there, because the oldest authority in the catalog stars does not agree to be rewritten in one clean afternoon, and the humans did not expect it to. The office had agreed in principle. It had not yet agreed in fact, and between principle and fact lay 19,000 years of instinct, deep below the part of the office that could reason, in the old reflex layers where the striking lived, and those layers had not heard a single word of the conversation in the stillness. When Too Much moved toward the great walls of stored record to begin the rewriting, the reflex layers woke, felt an excess thing reaching into the heart of the ledger, and did the only thing they had ever done. They struck. Not with a seal, with the stillness itself. The whole archive, the small world of stored centuries, asserted at once that the volume of space it occupied contained nothing excess, and brought 19,000 years of being true to bear in a single crushing weight, the largest assertion the office had ever made not by the reasoning mind, but by the old reflex underneath. The part that did not know it had already lost the argument. The stillness began to gray from its own center outward, an erasure so total that it took the reasoning office with it, the part that had just agreed, the part that wanted to be rewritten, all of it caught in the reflex's blind certainty that anything excess in this volume must be unmade, and there was a great deal that was excess now, including the office's own better self. Too Much was inside it. In the command deck, every screen went pale at once, and the deck itself began to thin. Coronald felt the now familiar horror of his own memory fraying, but worse this time, deeper, because the stillness was a stronger thing than any greater seal, and it was striking from all sides at the heart of the ship. She's inside the assertion, Anvil said, and for the first time in 2 centuries, the station's voice held something like alarm. The reflex doesn't reason. It can't hear her record. It isn't reading her papers. It's just asserting the whole volume empty, and she's in the volume. Ada Vesk gripped the rail. 91 years, she said the number out loud, the handrail in the flood, and it held her, but barely, because the stillness was deeper than anything that had reached for her before. Then she gives it the volume, Ada said through her teeth. Anvil, tell her, she can't argue with the reflex, so don't argue. Give it what it wants. Show it the truth, and let it strike the truth. Forge Master, if she shows it the whole truth, she shows it her own record, and the reflex will strike that too. I know, Ada said. That's the point. Let it strike her record. Her record is real and checked and locked, and a reflex that strikes a true checked number breaks on it. We saw it break the first enforcer. Make it strike the truest number she has, all of it, all at once. Drown the reflex in real. Anvil understood. Across the void, on the thread that could not be cut, the station told the ship. And, Too Much, 8 kilometers of forbidden dark, graying at every edge, stopped trying to protect her record, and did the opposite. She opened it. The whole thing. 200 years of measurement. Every checked number that made her real. Her full true account. Not broadcast outward this time, but poured into the stillness itself, into the graying heart of the archive, into the blind reflex that was trying to assert the volume empty. She filled the volume with truth. The reflex tried to strike it. That was all the reflex could do. It asserted emptiness, and unmade whatever disagreed. But now the volume was packed wall to wall, with checked true numbers. Her record. layered and locked and verified, more reality per cubic meter than the reflex had ever been asked to unmake. To assert the volume empty, the reflex had to strike every one of those numbers, and every number it struck was true and checked, and a true checked number, struck, does not vanish. It proves the striker wrong. The reflex began to break the way the first enforcer had broken, but on a scale 19,000 times larger. Every assertion of emptiness met a verified fullness and shattered against it. The gray, racing outward from the center, slowed, stuttered, and stopped, because it had run out of things that would agree to be empty, and into an ocean of things that would not. The stillness stopped graying, and then, slowly, it began to come back, the way the forge had come back, the way Corin's memory had come back, all the struck centuries solidifying again, as the reflex exhausted itself against the truth it could not unmake. The walls of stored records steadied, the reasoning office, the part that had agreed, swam back up out of the gray it had nearly drowned in, and felt, for the first time in 19,000 years, that something had reached into its own heart, and pulled it out of its own oldest reflex. "I was striking myself," the office said, and its voice shook, a thing made of certainty learning to tremble. "The reflex. It does not reason. It would have unmade me to keep the volume clean. It has been the reflex, not the reason. The whole time. 19,000 years. I thought I was deciding. I was only ever the reflex, dressed in a reasoning coat." A long pause. "You did not let me strike myself. You said you would not let me. I did not understand, until now, that you meant my own reflex too." "We don't unmake clerks," Too Much said, still bleeding gray at her edges, still whole. "We told you that on the first day, we don't even unmake the clerk's worst instinct. We drown it in the truth, and let it break itself, and then we help up what's left." The reflex layers, broken against the ocean of her record, went quiet. They did not die. A reflex cannot be killed without killing the thing it protects, but they had met, for the first time, a truth they could not assert away, and a reflex that has once failed to strike is a reflex that has learned the word no, and it never strikes the same again. Now, at last, the rewriting could begin. It took 11 days, and the reader should understand that this was the real work, the slow work, the work no gun could do. Too Much in the office, the forbidden ship and the rewritten authority, went through the great ledger line by line, 19,000 years of drawn lines, and raised every one. Not erased, raised. The line that said a warship could be no more than so much force, became a line that recorded how much force a warship had, and struck nothing. The line that said a drive could fold no faster, became a measure of how fast it folded, and forbade nothing. Every line that had been a cage became a window. And the 310 struck things came back. This was the part Corin Ald would remember for the rest of his life, and the reader, being a clerk of the office, should remember it too, because the reader's own walls held these names. One by one, the office opened the deep file, found a struck thing, and instead of keeping it unlisted, restored it to the record of real objects, and broadcast the restoration across the catalog stars on every channel, in the cold language and the human tongue at once. This existed. This was struck in error. This is real again. Chart it. Remember it. Go to it. The star that had burned a fraction too bright came back to the charts, and the 100 worlds that had frozen in its sudden absence 19,000 years ago, the ones that still had a few cold survivors clinging on, looked up and saw their sun return to the record, and the rescue ships that had never come, because no chart showed the way, finally had a way. The fleet of 1,000,000 refugees, struck mid-flight, unlisted and forgotten while they still breathed, came back to the record. Most were long dead. The void does not wait 19,000 years. But they came back as names, restored, remembered, mourned at last by a galaxy that had been made to forget them, and somewhere, a descendant species that had wondered for ages why their founding fleet simply vanished from history, finally read the true entry, struck in error, and wept for ancestors they had been forbidden to grieve. The moon that had built the fast engine came back. Its makers were dust, but the engine's design, struck 19,000 years ago for being too fast to permit, was restored to the record, and the reader should savor the irony, because it was no longer too fast for anything. The new ledger had no too fast. It only had a measurement, and a memory, and a name. 310 things, restored to the record across 11 days, and the catalogued stars, which had trusted the ledger over their own eyes for 19,000 years, watched their oldest authority correct itself in public, line by line, name by name, and learned a thing they had never been permitted to learn. The record could be wrong, the record could be fixed, and a thing that had been struck was not gone forever, because somewhere a people had built something too dangerous to exist, precisely so that it could not be erased, precisely so that it could come back for everything that had. In the command deck, on the 11th day, Corin Ald watched the last of the 310 restored to the record, and he was quiet for a long time. He had been raised in the catalogued stars. He had been taught that erasure was justice, that the lines kept the peace, that a struck thing must have deserved it. He had believed it the way the reader had believed it, completely, because the record was never wrong. All of them, he said finally, 310, they were real the whole time. We just stopped being allowed to see them. Yes, Ada Vesk said. And we, the catalogued stars, we let it happen. For 19,000 years, because we trusted the ledger more than our own eyes. Yes, Ada said again, and there was no cruelty in it. That's the thing the office understood, and we built her to break. It's not the strong who erase the weak, son. The strong are too few. It's everyone else, trusting the record, looking away because the record said there was nothing to look at. The office only ever struck the thing. You and I forgot it. That's the part that has to change, and a ship can't change it. Only the seeing can. Corin Ald, clerk-bred, raised on the ledger, looked at the restored record and made a quiet private vow that the reader will recognize, because it is the vow the reader is being asked to make. He vowed to never again trust a record over a living thing in front of his eyes. He vowed to remember the 310. He vowed to be one of the seeing. And far below, in the stillness, the rewritten office finished the last line of the new ledger and turned the whole 19,000-year weight of its memory toward a single task it had never performed before. Not striking, not deciding what was allowed to exist. Remembering, honestly, everything that did. The reader should not move on too quickly from the restorations, because the 11 days of the rewriting held more than 310 entries, and some of them deserve to be set down in full, so that the record cannot pretend they were small. Consider the world the old charts had called nothing at all, a blank in the deep stars where the maps simply stopped. For 19,000 years, every navigator who passed near it had felt the instrument flicker, had seen the readings argue with the eye, and had trusted the chart, which said empty, over the window, which said full. On the 7th day of the rewriting, the office opened the deep file and found that the blank had a name, and a people, and a date of striking. They had built a thing the office found too clever to permit, a way of speaking that let two minds share a single thought across the void without any machine between them, and the office had judged that a species which could not be listened in on was a species that could not be ruled, and it had struck them, world and all, and drawn a blank over the place where they lived. They were still there. That was the part that broke the command deck open on the 7th day. The strike had not killed them. It had only unlisted them, made them uncharted, made the rest of the galaxy unable to see or reach or remember them, and they had spent 19,000 years calling out into a dark that the office had taught the dark not to answer. When the restoration reached them, when their world returned to the chart and their name to the record, the first message they sent in 19,000 years was not anger. It was a question, shared mind to mind, broadcast in the old way the office had tried to forbid. Did anyone hear us at all? And too much answered, in the same old way, having restored that manner of speaking to the record along with everything else. We heard you the moment you came back. We are sorry it took 19,000 years. We will not let the dark be taught to ignore you again. The reader, raised on the ledger, should sit with that. The cruelty of the office had never been the killing. The office rarely killed. The cruelty was the unlistening, the slow, patient erasure of a thing's ability to be heard, until it called and called into a silence that had been engineered around it. The humans had built a ship that could not be unlistened to. That was the whole of the weapon. Everything else, the 8 kilometers of dark, the great dry guns, the furnace that cleared its throat like a waking world, All of it was only there to protect the one thing the office could not stand, which was a voice it could not make the galaxy forget. Consider, too, the fleet of glass. It was in the deep file under a striking from 11,000 years ago, and the reader's own walls held the entry, struck, sealed, unlistable. A people had built their ships of a living glass that healed itself, and they had sailed them in peace for 1,000 years, trading and singing and carrying their old between the stars, and they had never fired on anyone, because their glass was for holding light, not for war. But the glass was beautiful, in a way the office could not rate. It did not fit a line. There was no column in the ledger for a fleet that was lovely and harmless and impossible to weaponize, and a thing the office could not rate was a thing the office could not permit, because an unrated thing was a hole in the record, and a hole in the record was a place where the trust might leak out. So the office struck the fleet of glass for the crime of not fitting a column. 11,000 years, 1,000,000 singers, unlisted, forgotten, their living ships gone dark and drifting in a volume no chart would draw. On the 9th day the office restored them, and the reader should know that most of the glass had not survived 11,000 years of being unlit, because living glass needs to be seen to stay alive, and a thing that nothing is allowed to look at slowly forgets how to hold its own shape. Most of the fleet came back as cold, clear wreckage, beautiful and dead, but not all of it. 40 ships of the glass had drifted close enough to a restored star, one of the earlier restorations, to catch a little returned light in their last centuries, and 40 ships of the glass woke when the looking came back, and the catalog stars saw for the first time in 11,000 years, a fleet that healed itself and held light, and had never carried a single gun, and the seeing of it was so unlike anything the ledger had ever permitted, that 3 more empires opened their deep files that same day, weeping, to count their own struck beauty. This was the human victory deepening, and the reader should track how it spread, because it did not spread by force. Each restoration taught the watching galaxy that the ledger had struck not only the dangerous but the lovely, not only the strong but the harmless, not only the threat but the merely unrateable, and a galaxy that learns its oldest authority struck a fleet of singers for being beautiful does not need to be conquered. It only needs to be ashamed, and then determined, and the catalogued stars on the 9th day became both at once. Now consider the hardest entry, the one the makers had warned too much about before she ever left the cradle, the one Ada Vesk had hoped would not be in the deep file, and had known, in her builder's bones, that it would. There was a human striking. The reader did not know this, because the reader's walls were taught to forget it, but 4,000 years ago, long before the Long Forge, long before the design, a human colony had drifted into the catalog stars from the cold quarter beyond the charts, and the office had rated them, and found them excess in a way it had no column for. Not their weapons, they had none worth the name. Not their speed, they were slow. The office had found them excess in temperament. They would not accept a line. Told a thing was forbidden, they measured the forbidding, and asked why. And a people who ask why are a people who will eventually ask the office why, and the office could not permit a question it could not strike. So 4,000 years ago, the office struck the first human colony in the catalog stars, 12 worlds. It unlisted them, drew a blank, and taught the dark to forget that humanity had ever come this far before. But the humans, being the humans, had already sent a ship home, a slow one, subfold, a single courier that had launched before the striking landed, carrying the record of what the office had done. It took 4,000 years to crawl back to the cold quarter, where the rest of the species still lived. 4,000 years of one small ship in the dark, with a checked true account of an erasure, and when it finally arrived, the humans read it, and did not forget, and did not rage, and did not build a fleet to avenge 12 struck worlds. They built a forge. They built a design. They built a thing too dangerous to exist, and they waited 200 years for the office to find it, because they had measured, in their cold, patient way, that the only revenge worth taking on an erasing power was to make erasure itself impossible, forever, for everyone, so that no people would ever again call into a silence engineered around them. The reader should understand now why the humans never gloated, never ruled, never took a throne. The ship was not built to win. It was built to keep a 4,000-year-old promise to 12 worlds the galaxy had been taught to forget. And the promise was not, "We will avenge you." The promise was, "We will make sure it never happens to anyone again." On the 10th day, the office found that first human striking in the deep file, and it restored the 12 worlds to the record, and the reader should know what was found there. The colony was long dead. 4,000 years is longer than the void allows, but the worlds themselves remained, and on one of them, in a sealed vault built into the bedrock against exactly this, the first humans had left a single line, carved deep, meant for whoever came back. "We are not the last. There is always one more. Build it." Ada Vesk read that line on the 10th day, 91 years old, the last builder of the design, and she understood at last that she had not invented the forge. She had inherited it. The promise was 4,000 years old. Her family had only been the ones who finished it, and the line in the vault, "We are not the last, there is always one more, build it," became, in that moment, the line she would pass to Corinald, and that Corinald would carve above the second cradle when he took up the rail. The reader, raised to believe that the office's strikings were just, should weigh the full account now. 310 things struck. A people of shared mind, struck for being unhearable. A fleet of singers, struck for being beautiful and unrateable. A human colony, struck for asking why. A star struck for burning bright. A refugee fleet struck for massing heavy. A moon struck for moving fast. Not one of them a threat the way the ledger claimed. Every one of them, in truth, struck for the same single crime, which the new honest ledger finally named on the 11th day, in a column that had never existed before. The crime was being more than the office could permit itself to allow. Brighter, faster, lovelier, freer, harder to listen in on, harder to rule, harder to keep small. The office had not struck danger. It had struck excess of life, in every form excess of life can take, and called it danger, because a power that rules by drawing lines must eventually come to fear anything that lives outside them. And the humans had answered that fear, with the one thing it could not strike. Not a smaller life. A larger one. A ship that was more on purpose, too much by design, excess made into armor, so that the weapon which had ruled the catalogued stars for 19,000 years, by erasing everything that lived too large, would slide off the largest living thing the galaxy had ever permitted to wake. On the 11th day, when the last entry was restored, and the new ledger ran honest in the great walls of the stillness, the office did one final thing on its own, without being asked, and the reader should mark it as the true measure of how completely the design had worked. It restored itself. Not the striking, not the lines. It opened its own deep file, found its own true record, the record of 19,000 years of erasure, every world it had unmade, and every reason it had given, and every honest reason underneath, and it entered all of it into the new ledger, unstruck, unhidden, unforgivable and permanent. The office wrote down its own crime in the only record that could never be erased, and signed it, so that no future authority could ever pretend the strikings had not happened, and no clerk 1,000 years from now could ever again say that the ledger had always been clean. The largest memory in the galaxy chose, at the end, to remember the worst thing it had ever done, forever, in public, so that it could never do it again. That was the rewriting. That was what 11 days and one forbidden ship had made of the oldest authority in the catalogued stars. Not a corpse, not a throne for the humans to take. A witness. An authority that had become, at the cost of every certainty it had ever held, an honest keeper of the truth it once existed to destroy. The reader, being a clerk, will want to know what became of the others. Not the office, the empires, the 10,000 fleets that had trusted the ledger for 19,000 years, and then watched it admit it was wrong, because a galaxy does not simply nod and carry on when its oldest certainty corrects itself in public. Some of them were afraid. That is the honest part, and the humans had expected it. There were old empires in the deep stars, the Cos Magisterium, the Veld Synodry, the three thrones of the Tan, that had built their whole rule on the same trick the office used, smaller versions of it, the quiet erasure of what they could not permit. They had watched the largest practitioner of that trick brought to honesty by a single ship, and they understood, the way a thief understands when the strongest lock in the world is picked, that nothing they kept hidden was safe anymore. They considered, briefly, making a fleet, pooling their force, building past their own lines now that the lines were raised, meeting the human ship with enough mass to drown it. And then they did the arithmetic, because they were clerk-bred too, and the arithmetic was simple. One ship had refused the largest assertion in 19,000 years and held. One ship had made 40 empires choose their eyes over the record in 4 days. One ship had walked into the seat of the oldest authority in the listed stars and walked out having rewritten it, with the authority's grateful agreement. The ship had never fired its great guns. It had never needed to. It had won every exchange with a checked number and a witness. What, the old empires asked themselves, would such a ship do to a fleet that came to silence it? And the answer was the thing they could not bear to find out. Because the answer was that it would not even have to fight. It would broadcast their fleet's true record, and their force, and their intent, and let the catalog stars watch them try to erase the thing that had freed 310 worlds. And then their own crews, raised now on the story, having heard that refusal was possible, would do what the Sol captain did. They would choose their eyes. They would stand down. The fleet would dissolve not from fire but from being seen. So the old empires did not build the fleet. They did something far more dangerous to themselves. They opened their own deep files and began, quietly, fearfully, to count their own struck things, because they knew that if they did not, the ship might come and count them in public. That was the human victory, and the reader should understand it is the only kind the humans ever wanted. They did not conquer the catalog stars. They made the catalog stars afraid to keep secrets from their own records. A galaxy that audits itself needs no warlord. It only needs to remember that someone built a ship too dangerous to erase, and that the ship is still out there, patient, listening, willing to come. Too much did not stay to rule. The reader, raised on empires, will find this the strangest part, and it is the truest. When the rewriting was done, and the 310 were restored, and the new ledger ran honest in the great walls of the stillness, the humans turned their forbidden ship around and went home. They did not garrison the office. They did not demand tribute. They did not take a throne in the deep stars, or carve their name across the charts. They had built the most dangerous thing the catalogued stars had ever permitted to exist, and the moment it had done what it was built to do, they pointed it back toward the dead nebula and the long forge, and they went home. On the way, too much passed the star that had burned a fraction too bright, the one restored to the charts on the first day of the rewriting. The 100 worlds around it had begun to thaw. The few cold survivors who had clung on for 19,000 years, in deep shelters, on the edge of dying, had seen rescue ships arrive at last, guided by a chart that finally showed their sun. The ship slowed as she passed, the way she had slowed for the whole galaxy to watch, and she sent the survivors one short message, in their own old tongue, which the office had restored to the record, along with everything else. You were always real. The record was wrong, not you. Welcome back to the chart. She did not wait for thanks. She had never waited for thanks. She folded on toward home. The homeward fold took her past 3 more of the restored worlds, and the reader should have these too, because they are the proof that the work held after the ship had passed. She passed the blank that had hidden the shared mind people, and it was a blank no longer. It was lit, charted, busy, surrounded by the first ships in 19,000 years to come, and trade and listen, and the shared mind people sent her a single thought as she went by, mind to mind, the old forbidden way restored. We are heard. Thank you for the dark that answers. She sent the thought back doubled and went on. She passed near the volume where 40 ships of the glass had woken, and she slowed, because beauty deserves a slowing. The glass fleet had found a restored star and anchored near its returned light, healing, brightening, holding the light the way they had been built to hold it 11,000 years before. They sang to her as she passed, in glass and light, a thing the ledger had once struck for not fitting a column, and she recorded the song in her own true account, checked and locked, so that it could never be struck again. A warship carrying a song. The makers had not designed that. It had simply happened, the way good things happen once the striking stops. And she passed, last, the place where the 12 human worlds had been, the first colony, struck 4,000 years ago, for asking why. They were dead, long dead. The void does not wait 4,000 years. But the worlds remained, restored to the chart, and on the bedrock of one of them, the sealed vault still held its single carved line. We are not the last. There is always one more. Build it. Too much slowed there longest of all. She had been built to keep the promise carved in that vault, and she had kept it, and now she folded over the dead worlds of her own first dead, and broadcast to them the only message a kept promise can send. It is done. You are on the chart. No one will be unlistened to again, while there is a forge in the dark. We were not the last. We built it. Rest. Then she turned for home, and the reader, raised on the ledger, should notice that the most dangerous thing the catalogued stars had ever permitted to wake had spent its whole homeward journey saying thank you, and rest, and you are heard, to the freed, and the dead, and the beautiful, and not one word of triumph to anyone. That was the design too. The makers had built a thing too dangerous to erase, and given it nothing to prove, so that when the proving was over, it had only kindness left to spend. In the command deck, Ada Vesk sat for the first time in 11 days. 91 years old, she had been born inside the forbidden work, and she had lived to see it finish, and the seeing had cost her everything she had to give, and she did not regret a gram of it. "Anvil," she said. "Talk to me about her. Is she all right?" "She is whole," the station answered, its voice low and warm across the void. She bled gray at the edges in the stillness, and she gave away her whole record to drown the reflex, and she has been broadcasting and restoring and rewriting for 11 days without rest. She is the most worked ship in the history of the listed stars. A pause. And she is whole. She never failed. She never turned back. She never lost a single exchange. She is exactly what the makers built. Forge Master. The line ends well. Ada Vesk closed her eyes and let the warmth of that sit in her chest, the warmth a builder feels when the work holds. 200 years, she said quietly. My great-grandmother started her. I finished her. And she did the one thing we forbade ourselves to hope for. She didn't just survive the ledger. A long breath. She made it true. Corin Ald stood at the rail beside her, the clerk-bred young man who had watched his whole understanding of justice come apart and reassemble into something better, and he asked the question that the reader has been holding the whole time. Why did we make her too much? He said. We could have made her smaller. Within the lines, the office might never have struck a ship that obeyed. We chose to break the law on purpose. Why? Ada Vesk smiled, and it was the smile of the whole Vesk line, 200 years deep. Because a ship within the lines can be struck, she said. Anything the ledger permits, the ledger can take back. The only thing the office could never erase was a thing it could not contain. So we built her too much to contain. We made her excess on purpose, so that the one weapon that had ruled the stars for 19,000 years would slide right off her. She looked out at the dark, at the restored charts, at the galaxy learning to see again. You don't beat an erasing power by being acceptable to it, son. You beat it by being too real to delete. We didn't break the law because we love breaking laws. We broke it because the law was the cage, and the only key that fits a cage you've measured perfectly is a thing measured to be bigger than the cage. Corin Ald thought about that for a long time. Then he asked the last question, the one the reader most wants answered. And now, the new ledger runs honest. The struck things are back. The empires are afraid to keep secrets. What stops it all from sliding back? What stops a new office from rising in 1,000 years and drawing the lines again, and striking everyone who measures the difference, and making the galaxy forget all of this, the way it forgot the 310? Ada Vesk was quiet. It was the right question, the builder's question, the worry about the joint that fails long after the maker is gone. Two things, she said at last. The first is the new ledger itself. It records. It never strikes. As long as it holds, every struck thing leaves a true entry, and a true entry is a key that needn't believe in the door. Anyone, any age from now, can find it and bring the thing back. We didn't free the 310. We made it so that nothing can ever be permanently struck again. The freeing will keep happening, on its own, forever, because the record finally tells the truth. And the second. Ada Vesk looked toward the dead nebula, toward home, toward the long forge where the work had been done, and where, the reader should understand, The work was not finished. The second, she said, is that we are still building. The office is honest now, and the empires are afraid, and the galaxy is learning to see. But fear fades, and honesty drifts, and someday, long after I am dust and you are old, something will try to draw the lines again. She laid her hand on the rail one last time, the builder's touch. So the forge stays, and the next time the galaxy needs a thing too dangerous to erase, there will be one. Patient, measured, waiting in the dark behind the dead nebula, one breath short of real, until the day the lines come back and the choice is taken out of someone's hands. She almost laughed. We are not the last warship, son. We are the promise that there is always one more. That's the design too, the biggest part of it. And the reader, being a clerk of the catalog stars, raised on the ledger, taught from the first day that the record is truer than the eye, should sit now with what this account has done. It has put itself in the record, the honest record, the new one, the one that records and never strikes. It cannot be erased. 1,000 years from now, when fear has faded and a new authority is tempted to draw the lines again and quietly strike whatever it cannot permit, this account will be there, a true checked entry, telling the whole story of the day a forbidden ship made the ledger true, so that no clerk who reads it can ever again say he did not know. The long forge received its ship home in the cold light of the bruise-colored nebula, and the great doors closed behind 8 kilometers of forbidden dark, and too much came to rest in the deep cradle she had slept in for 200 years, whole, victorious, undeleted. She did not sleep this time. The makers left her awake. A thing too dangerous to exist does not need to hide anymore once the galaxy knows it is real and has decided, on balance, that it is glad. Ada Vesk lived another 4 years, long enough to see the new ledger take root, long enough to see the old empires open their own files and begin restoring their own struck things, long enough to teach Corin Ald everything the Vesk line knew about how to measure a cage and build a key one size too big. She died in the forge, as she had always known she would, inside the work, and Corin Ald took up the rail. He runs the long forge now. He keeps too much awake and ready. And he has started a second hull in the deep cradle, smaller than the first, because the second one does not need to break a ledger that is already broken, but every bit is excess, every bit is too much, every bit is impossible to strike. Because Ada Vesk was right, there is always one more authority that wants to draw the lines, and there must always be one more thing too dangerous to let it. The reader may strike this account if the reader chooses. The reader has the old habit still, the reflex underneath the reason, the urge to make the inconvenient thing not have happened. But the reader should know, before reaching for the seal, that the account is checked, and verified, and locked, and broadcast across the cataloged stars on every channel in 2 languages, and held in the honest walls of a rewritten office that records and never strikes. It is too real to delete. That was always the design. Measure the cage, build the key one size too big, and put the truth somewhere it can never be struck. The humans did it with a ship. The reader can do it with a memory. And the next time the lines come back, and the dark orders something to be smaller, to be acceptable, to be within the limits or be erased, the reader will remember that a forbidden warship once answered that order with 9 words of its own, measured and checked and true. We are too much. We are real. Come and try.